Greg, our last podcast, we were looking at the Defence Investment Plan, and frankly, at the weekend, both you and I were planning that it sounded as if it was going to be released on Monday. I now understand that it's actually not going to be released potentially until August time, which is a year's delay. Have you heard anything more about it at the moment?
Well, like you, I mean, I've been waiting for every rumor. Obviously, I mean, I had heard that to not do it before the NATO summit on the 17th, I think, would or 11th maybe, it would be difficult for the government to walk into the NATO summit with no budget agreed. So yeah, I think that is looming on their calendar. So I'm going to go with a week from now.
Yeah, no, I'd heard about the NATO summit, but anyway, the point is it's still not out there, despite lots of vagaries. And why it's important is it links to an initiative the Air and Space Power Association have been championing, which you've been a big part of. I'll try and get this to appear properly in front of me, but basically World War III, which looks very provocative, but actually in headlines, this is trying to make the case as to why inaction is action. In other words, it leaves us vulnerable. Can you give us a bit of a background as to why the Air and Space Power Association decided to put this together? And then we can look at what's inside it and how we've launched it.
Yeah, it's a fairly straightforward story, but and of course you contributed too, Sean. So
Yes.
let's not beat around the bush. We recognise that we were having lots of internal conversations, agreeing violently with each other about what we thought should be done, but we weren't reaching the people that we needed to reach. And I guess if I summarise those in two camps, one is the politicians, the ones who make the decisions about the money, etc., and one is the public. And the reason the public is so important is they obviously need to be happy spending more money on defence, and some might not be. And secondly, it isn't just about defence. As the book covers in a couple of the chapters, it's about national resilience, national will, national effort. And we're not there. Psychologically, the country is nowhere close. When you look at what Ukraine puts up with every single day, how would this country cope with anything remotely like that? That's what we're trying to provoke with the book, and we decide to write this one in a way that will catch people's attention. So it's not an instruction manual. It's not a wordy military document. It's a story. It's a Tom Clancy like story.
I was going to say, because when you and I initially spoke about this, I think there's a big body of opinion out there that's getting frustrated, even the serving folks, that the government's made certain commitments. We've said to NATO we're going to go to 3.5%, but to date there's been no money flowing, and the government says, "Oh, we're spending more on defence than we ever spent." But we went through last week how actually that's not going to make a difference. That's not going to turn the dial, and that's what the Defence Investment Plan was all about. And I think that growing sense of frustration. Well, what can we do about it? And when you and I were talking about it, that's what I thought was quite interesting about this approach, because just writing chapters, was it 2 years ago or a year ago when the little booklet
Yeah,
was
two
done?
years.
That was more of a sort of an academic look about the roles of air power. Was this time you were pretty clear, weren't you? We want to try and do a bit of Tom Clancy-esque style. And the danger is that when I read through it all, having been involved in it, there is a danger that it looks a bit alarmist, but that wasn't actually the intention, was it? It's not designed to be scaremongering. It's designed to demonstrate what happens if you don't prepare.
Yeah, it's definitely, well, here's the honest truth. It's got to scare a little bit, because you've got to kind of believe that could happen. And that book is factual, by the way. There's nothing in there that we've made up. So it could happen. We've said in the various bits around the book, including in the sort of prologue, if you like, it's not a prediction. It's aimed at 2030. If you remember, we had a long conversation when we were coming up with the idea about when to pitch it. And we felt that 2030 was a sensible time. The back cover of the book quotes Mark Rutte of NATO saying, in 2025, we've got 5 years. So that's the provenance of 2030. 2030 is important as well. It doesn't matter how much money you spend today, not a lot of that will have an effect by 2030. So you are largely going to fight with what you've got. So it is a kind of a warning call there. But it's also a warning of what might happen if we don't act. If we were to act and look tougher, look more ready, maybe we can stop that war happening in 2030. So that's why it's not trying to totally scaremonger. And there's some pretty brutal things in that. I'm not going to give away the story, but the final chapter is a bit of a wake-up call. But that is what could happen in theory if we're not ready.
And I think that was for me what was quite a, I mean, all of us are busy people, but actually to be involved in contributing, not just the written word, but the talking around it and everything, was trying to bring our experience to bear that was going, if you don't do anything, let's just extrapolate where we are today to where in the future would be. One of the things before we get into one of the chapters, which I'm particularly keen to get into today, in terms of launching, we also had quite a good launch, didn't we, for this event? Just talk us through what happened there.
Yeah, so it came out on Monday, and the great thing about this book is it's free. There's a danger with when you give away free books, is people think they might not be worth reading. Well, that might be true, but you're not going to waste any money, and it takes less than 2 hours to read, so you're not going to waste a massive amount of time. You can get it on our website electronically and chip away there, or if you're at various events, we'll hand out free copies. We launched this in the House of Commons at a reception on Monday evening, where we invited as many MPs and Lords as we could get in the room. As is the case with any of these launches, you're a victim of the politics at the time, and there were some votes going on that were taking up people's time. But we had about a dozen people in, and I certainly spoke to all of them, and hopefully the word will get out. The hard work starts now. Is now we need to really push the book. We're talking to a number of media outlets and journalists about taking this to the next level. You and I think, are going to cover large elements of it here through the podcast over the coming weeks. But yeah, it was. It's always fun, isn't it, having a bit of a book launch? It's not something we do every day. I'm not used to it. But yeah, a bit of a soft launch. But we're hoping that it'll catch fire. I mean, as it happened, I won't mention names, but there was me, and the two of the other authors whose names I will not mention, were sat down at breakfast in the RAF club, and an MP sat down with us. At which point I said, "You need to read this book," and shoved it straight under his nose. So I think you might even know who it is. But yeah, so look, if you find me anywhere, or yourself or Clive handing out books willy nilly, yeah, we're going to be trying to distribute it somewhat unconventionally.
But I think that, to be honest, that is the important point of this, isn't it? There's been a huge amount of work gone in behind the scenes here. We get asked regularly because we're part of various communities here. What can we do to help? In other words, what can these communities do to help? Well, part of it is have a look through it, and if you think it's any good, distribute it. It costs nothing to forward the link, and the more people we get to read it, the more it provokes a reaction. And I think what is I particularly think is interesting. Well, let's get into chapter two, because I think for me that's the first one of the chapters that I had a vested interest in it, but also it talks about stuff you can extrapolate from today. And as a brief synopsis, effectively, Putin on maneuvers is the title of it. But in effect, it says that Putin's war in Ukraine ground steadily to a halt. There was a sort of a ceasefire sort of agreed, but an uncomfortable ceasefire with a buffer zone. Putin's economy was still raging fast. What NATO wasn't quite sure how to support Ukraine in this sort of interregnum, as it were. Some nations were prepared to lean into it, some were not. But Putin hadn't finished. It was unfinished business. And actually, all of a sudden, we now talk about Belarus falling. Well, I see Belarus is in the news again today because Alexander Lukashenko, is a dictator, the last European dictator. And, it's a hair's breadth away, frankly, for Belarus to actually become Russian. Russia's pushed nuclear weapons in and the like. And all we do is go, right, that now happens. That means Russia's influence is now on two sides of Ukraine, makes it very uncomfortable. And then, given that America looks a bit flaky, Russia has a go at the Baltic states. And it raises those really interesting questions that say, would America come rushing across to Article 5 NATO if Russia moved into Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia? Now, the headline answer is obviously yes. But we've already seen in the last week, Putin's been throwing drones around into Romania. That one of those hit and damaged a block of flats, several people injured, and it's not the first time this happened. It's the 28th time it's happened. So all of this is very believable, and it just demonstrates the problems we've got, particularly around mass, isn't there? Now, I know you weren't close to writing that, but what was your reflections on the sort of key lessons to come out of that?
Yeah, so I mean, just heading back to the beginning of the book, in the prologue, we sort of set out the political things that happened leading up to 2030. And then you, of course, wrote chapter two about the specifics. I mean, I think the hardest thing about writing the prologue is the real world was catching up. trying to present some scenarios that would take you through 27, 28, 29. They were happening weekly. America pulling out of NATO and removing troops. Damn, right, that's happened. Tick. And then of course the war in Iran happened, which has depleted their capability. And so a lot of the things that we write about in this book are far from fantasy. In fact, they could well happen before 2030. So yeah, what did I take away from your chapter? I'll call it your chapter. It was this fact that a few things, and it's only a few things, need to happen to stretch NATO quite significantly. And imagine that we've been doing this from now until 2030. That's 4 years of hard graft. A peacekeeping force in Ukraine, which is what we talk to in our book, is going to be hard work for NATO. Not everyone will be able to do it. Not everyone will want to do it. And by the time the 8th turn of the handle has come around, which it might do in our scenario, you're starting to get quite thin. And if you're having to cover that, then who's covering the Baltics? Who's covering Poland? Now, we know that some European nations are clearly stepping up their spending. So there's high likelihood, therefore, that some of those nations will be able to present a strong front. But everything that we see in the moment from America tells us that whilst they're not going to bail out of the alliance, we should not plan on seeing large numbers of armed forces from America as being part of that first line of defense. So my big takeaway is NATO stretched. Belarus then is almost like a dagger to the heart in terms of the geography, particularly exposing the Baltic states, which we all know is a critical area, and it's the one we focus on. And an America that is more distant than it is now, if that's possible.
Yeah, and I think what it does it interesting. I mean, there's lots of perspectives, so I'm going to ramble a little bit here, but what we looked at was going, okay, so what commitment does the UK make to Ukraine security? That reinforce the ceasefire. If it can't be NATO, the French are pretty forward-leaning, the Brits are. So we looked at a relatively modest 8 aircraft fighter deployment into one of the air bases that's in Ukraine to act as a deterrence, to act as helping train the Ukrainians and it looks fairly modest. The trouble is, when you look at the maths of it, to sustain 8 aircraft, 12, 14 pilots, which is a full squadron's worth, throughout the year, really, when you and I were doing, what was it, 4 months on, 4 months off, 4 months preparing. So actually, you need 3 squadrons in order to maintain a single squadron fully there.
Yeah.
We've only got 7 Typhoon outfits. And if you look at, we've also got the Falkland Islands, which we've got to sustain. And of course, we provide a bit of conjecture that the Argentinians were getting a bit feisty. To your points, I then read in the newspapers, that's exactly what's actually happening. We've got some of the Cypriot folks are saying we should get out of Cyprus. We've got quick reaction north and south manned routinely 24/7. And all of a sudden you go, actually, it's really difficult, given the very limited supplies of assets we've got, for the UK to support a permanent detachment of 8 aircraft in Ukraine. And if we were to do that, you've effectively, a bit like the Battle of Britain, the last day of the Battle of Britain, we've got everything deployed. And therefore, you've got nothing to go and act as a savior elsewhere. So despite the fact that, it's an awesome capability, my goodness, are we spread thin?
So you know this because you were in the room. We talked a long time about how close to the truth we could get without crossing into the Official Secrets Act. We do some maths in the book. You do some maths in that chapter, exactly as you've just rehearsed there, about what that commitment might look like. Subsequent chapters talk about some attacks on the UK for which we're highly reliant on Typhoons to defend against. When you add all these things up, you come up to more squadrons than we currently have. So when you read the book, keep adding up keep score and realize just how thin we are. And that is the issue I think we wanted people to take away, that we have got some great capability. In fact, some of our chapters go right into the cockpit and talk about the latest technologies, the latest weapon systems, and how they will be able to do certain things, but we won't be able to do much of it. And I think that's the dichotomy the UK armed forces have. We are at the very high end of capability in all regards, mostly, but incredibly thin.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I took away from that, we always used to talk about concurrency, and actually that's was always very difficult to do. Now you've got so many commitments, everything is getting heated up. I think the one other element which um, I'll try and find the graphics for it. But do you remember when we were at Bryce Norton, we were invited along for that Air and Space Power event there. You interviewed Cab Townsend in front of a
Yeah,
map which showed
slide.
how many things were going on, how many hours had been flown, and yeah, it was phenomenal achievement. But there is a counter side to that, which we are now trying to explore. Is that um, although it looks very impressive what the Air Force is doing today, and it's become a sort of first responder, so of course it wants to be seen to be doing well. The question is actually how much are we using tomorrow's resources today? And if that is true, actually, are we hollowing out defence for the future? And some of the things, for example, when you and I were serving, remember we used to have these harmony guidelines, and you had to track whether max amount of time people could spend away from was four
Yeah,
months away from home, and if you were spending more time than that, it went amber, and if you went quickly into red. Why was that important? Because we judged, wrongly or rightly, that the longer you spent away from home, great fun, but actually you'd burn yourself out, and therefore people would leave the service or become disenchanted. We're not reporting that today. And I know firsthand that a number of our people on the front line, particularly in certain forces, Typhoon being one of them, are away considerably more
yeah,
than those minimums. And
yeah.
therefore, and we also know that that has long-term implications about people leaving before their time. Why does that matter? It matters because it costs a hell of a lot of money to train pilots and a lot of the people around the specialist trades. You need them to stay for so many years to provide some sort of payback. And if they leave earlier, we are absolutely nadgered as a service.
Mm.
And we're not we're not showcasing that. I remember in Afghanistan that they were flying lots of fast jet hours, huge numbers, effectively bringing the out of service date of the aircraft earlier because we were consuming hours faster than we had budgeted for. We're not tracking that. And part of that is because I suspect the service is not allowed to, because that would actually be demonstrating the pain that's being felt. So everybody's happy to showcase how well everybody's doing without recognizing that we are burning tomorrow's resources today.
Yeah, I mean, I can reassure people that, I mean, that it is tracked. I know that for a fact. You're right; it's not public knowledge, because it probably is winking amber, if not red, across the board. And that's not just the Air Force. I'm sure that's the case in other. And when we've already seen the problems that the Navy's going through, they're out the other side and they're in the worn out phase, where they're struggling. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that despite the dip hasn't been released, we're already hearing rumours of an above inflation pay rise, which is what's having to be done to counteract, the retention negative effect of deploying. And you and I know this. It's not just about deploying, more and more away from home, etc. Particularly if you've got kids, family, etc. But if you spend a lot of time away doing relatively routine QRA missions, you actually lose your skill sets because you're not training at the high end of stuff. You're away from the simulator, you're away from the EW ranges, the weapon ranges, etc. So, which is why the Air Force tends to stick to 4 month cycles, in order to make sure that you don't have too much skill fade. But that just means that the date comes around quicker, for the next squadron. I mean, it was interesting. I was talking to two of the MPs, an MP and a Lord, or Baroness, as it turns out, in that reception on Monday. They had just come back from the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme visit to Romania, where we have a Typhoon squadron doing QRA for NATO. And now, how many people in the UK even know that, or even aware of it? There's been lots of focus on Cyprus and the Middle East, understandably so. There's the normal focus on UK. We've got 1/7 of our fast jet force deployed to Romania, reassuring Romania and keeping Russia honest. Yeah, we're thin.
But the other corollary of that is that I know it's a bit of a drum I beat regularly, but I remember you and I having some sparring when we were serving about the balance between live and synthetic, and we've made some assumptions in defence that where we used to get 220 hours flying a year, um, the balance between live flying and synthetic flying has moved. Let's call it 50-50. So 110 hours live, 110 hours synthetic. That's fine in routine operations. If you're going to deploy to go and actually defend Romania, if you're going to do quick reaction alert and intercept a Russian
Yeah,
bear,
yeah.
if you're going to be flying, You can't do that in a simulator because you're not having any impact. It's got to be done in the live environment. And when you start looking at the number of different attachment deployments, we are putting a lot more hours on these airframes. Now, I'm sure the young men and women who are flying them love it, the fact that they're getting plenty of hours. But the airframes and the spare support is all in excess of what we funded. So all of a sudden, we are burning up the hours, etc., a lot quicker than we planned. And I think that's something that we're hiding away the problem for the future.
Well, it's even more blunt than that. So a pilot who's allocated a theoretical 110 hours a year is flying them in 3, 4 months. What are they supposed to do for the rest of the year? Well, so what happens is the Treasury picks up the bill, hopefully for the additional operational hours, and you get your peacetime training hours back in the budget. But aviation fuel's not getting any cheaper. We know the MOD budget is under pressure. My understanding is they're currently being asked for efficiency savings in year in order to make the books balance. So and you can kind of fudge that in peacetime when you're not doing much. They're everywhere. They're all over the place. We've got air transport flying up and down the countryside and across to Europe, etc. We've got P8s flying probably more hours than they ever thought they would, chasing submarines. Yeah, it's well, let's be honest, Sean. We have been creating a peacetime air force in terms of its budget. Now that we're having to get to a sort of almost transition to war moment where the activity is not just your routine training, it is genuinely operational activity, the model doesn't work. The model starts to unwind.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I think that there's no even if you suddenly squirted more money today, you wouldn't suddenly be able to go down to Waitrose and buy more Typhoons. You can't just suddenly pluck loads of pilots off the shelf. Um, but I do think part of that chapter, part going back to the World War III, the book, it's trying to breathe life into the fact that we are vulnerable at the moment. And another example I would use of that is that I think deterrence is as much about your potential adversary seeing jeopardy, seeing consequences. When Ursula von der Leyen turns around and says he's crossed the red line with these drone attacks into Romania, you go, okay, if it's a red line, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And I don't mean summoning the ambassador or writing a stiff letter or standing up in the House of Commons and condemning it, because frankly, that just doesn't work. And I know I got a bit of, flack the other day about this, but, when Turkey had a couple of Russian fighters come into its airspace back in 2015, they were warned to go away. One turned back, the other one didn't. Turkey shot them down.
Yeah.
Now, Putin went apoplectic. There was, all sorts of threats. But the hard fact remains is Putin respects firm, decisive action. And never again did a Russian aircraft go into Turkish airspace. For some reason, we keep talking about defense like the drone wall. Let's build a drone wall on the eastern flank of NATO. You think that's lining up all of your football players on the goal mouth and hoping that's going to stop you losing the match.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, your chapter talks about something that's a future event and clearly a higher rate of effort than we currently do today. But even today's effort is proving difficult. So you remember just the other week that rivet joint, our I-Star surveillance plane, was flying over the Black Sea and was buzzed yet again by Russia, which they did a couple of years ago. We started escorting them with Typhoons, if you remember. Well, it looks like they weren't escorted this time. I've not seen any confirmation, but it looks like that's the case. And I understand that the act now is that we've suspended those surveillance flights. So you've kind of let Russia win, in that case. But it may be that we don't have the Typhoons to escort the RJ every time it does a surveillance mission. So we're not at war, but we're already potentially demonstrating how stretched we are. Or not just about stretched, is it? It's also about will. What are you prepared to do? And look, it is not worth losing a rivet joint to an accident created by some nutter Russian pilot. So clearly we need to make sure we're being safe here. But when Russia is continuing to strike civilian targets, now I think the Romanian one was probably an accident, but you can't tell with Russia. They'll want you to think it was an accident, but who knows?
Yeah, and if you took it in isolation, I get it, but it's not isolated. 28 times drones have gone across into Romanian airspace. Secondly, you've got the Russian submarines constantly threatening our undersea cables. You've got the Yantar, the spy ship that's regularly flowing around the shores. You've got the head of GCHQ turning around and saying Russia is mounting its cyber attacks more regularly against our country. You can't paint that as one-offs. That is a pattern of behavior
Yeah,
that is Russian pushing and testing us. And if
yeah.
each time we simply step back, Russia will just keep expanding. It will feel emboldened. And that has long-term implications for us. And that's why I do wonder whether, in a way, going back to the book, part of the book is going, it's not just about military equipment. You can't solve the 2030 problem by suddenly throwing a lot of money at Waitrose and hoping they'll stock Typhoon fighter jets. But if you recognize that we are actually vulnerable, we need to have a different approach. We have to recognize that Russia is a threat.
Yeah.
And what can we collectively do, whole of society, to make sure that we do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, we skipped past chapter one, but chapter one has a go at our critical national infrastructure. Now, I would argue, in fact, the chapter sort of hints at it, that would cross a threshold that we would see as an act of war. But they're three independent events. I won't say what they are because you need to go read the book. But those events are all very doable, and they're things that Russia flirts with on a daily basis. Arson attacks, fiddling about around undersea cables, mucking about in space. I'll use those words. What we demonstrate in this book, and I'm going to correct you slightly, although obviously it's meant to look like World War III, it's called World War 3.0 for a reason. What it's saying is this is not war as you know it. It is, and it's not even 2.0. We've gone past 2.0. We're in 3.0. But it is not going to be fought necessarily as conventionally as wars are currently fought. Russia is a known protagonist who will do these things to us that will seek to not cross the threshold. So everything he does to us today is to desensitize us as to where that threshold is. And when he does eventually cross it, if he chooses to, it'll be too late. The damage will be irreparable. And in that first chapter, we do something to the UK that I don't know how this country would even react. It would be in complete shutdown.
And I think that's
In
the
many
point of the book, isn't it? Is to create very believable scenarios that are extrapolating where we are today, but on the basis that we continue to have a politically try to avoid making some decisive decisions. And I think that's really powerful. If I could bridge on from that, because you mentioned space, then a couple of little vignettes. I was fortunate enough to go to visit a company called New Orbit yesterday. In fact, long story behind it. Won't get involved in that. I'm not paid by them. I'm not. It is, but it was. They've just secured a load of funding, and you end up with this little back street of a corner of Swindon, and it didn't feel like a space facility at all. But they're just about to move. The clever bit, though, the reason it got me intrigued is they're looking at very low Earth orbit satellites. And in principle, without getting into technology, if you go down, they're looking about 250 kilometers up. Now, that sounds to me like a long way up, but the harsh reality is most of the satellites are thousands of kilometers up. Why is that? Because there's no drag up there. Once you've got it in orbit, you basically don't need to power the satellite. It just drifts round and round in space. Once you're at 250 kilometers, there's quite a lot of atmosphere there. And therefore, if you simply put a satellite in, it would start to slow down. If it started to slow down, it would come down. So in effect, you've got to power it the whole time. Well, conventional ways of powering these things are chemical thrusters. That's what most of the satellites use to move themselves a little bit. But you can only carry so much chemical up. So this company is now developing a little ion engine. And I'm not smart enough to be able to explain to you exactly how it works. But basically, it spits out particles at 60 kilometers a second. And that is how it gets its thrust. And it creates all sorts of interesting challenges because you can't just put out a big solar array to power it, because actually that is drag, and therefore you've got to redesign the satellite and everything. The huge advantage, of course, is the lower you get, because of physics, if you want to get 30 centimeter resolution, you need to have a bloody big camera when it's up high. It can be significantly smaller if it's lower. And therefore, it's much easier to put this stuff up. You want 5 years of life expectancy out of the satellite. And the other thing is because this satellite is going through drag, you actually can fly it. You don't need to thrust out. You literally just move surfaces and fly the satellite around. Why is that important? It means that if you've got a Russian or a submarine, a Russian or a Chinese, grabber that's trying to do you ill, you just fly away from it. And it also means that if at the end of its life, rather than at the moment, you end up with this space debris whistling around, once it runs out, it starts to slow down, and therefore it's a self-cleaning orbit. Now, have they got some massive technology challenges to overcome? Yes, they have. Have they just raised a lot of money? Yes, they have. Is this a really exciting prospect? Yes. And I was thoroughly inspired because I
Yeah.
went, it sounds almost impossible, but it's a great example of what we can do in this country when
Yeah.
we put our mind to it.
Well, of course, we are the Air and Space Power Association, so we are moving further and further now. We hold a defence space conference every year, as well as our air power one. You're right. There's some great technology businesses in the UK. It's so frustrating, of course, that our space what shall I enterprise, it still struggles with some of the launch aspects. We're still in the foothills of getting a launch, and yet we're in quite a good place geography wise for Europe for launch because of our Outer Hebrides Islands, for example. And of course, we do need to think about how we will continue to resupply space. If Russia's going to start causing mischief up there, which we know it can, chapter one does a bit of that. We need to be able to replace them or move them around, as you rightly point out. So that technology becomes vital. Another advantage of low Earth is it's easier to get there, so launch becomes easier. You don't necessarily want a satellite to last 5 years because you want to update and send a new one out there that's even more spangled. So, and of course, at the moment, Elon Musk has cornered the market. So we do need to be looking at alternatives because space is such a critical aspect. And as World War 3.0 tries to hint and actually demonstrates in some of the chapters, the connectivity of our assets is so critical to the machine working properly. So yeah, you buy more platforms, but if they're not talking to each other, and they're not integrated, then you're not really getting the value for money out of them. So yeah, that integration piece, space is now such a critical part of that.
Yeah, and also if we are looking as given we're so dependent on space, and given the future of NATO, where do we sit with alliances? How do we ensure our security? I do wonder. Space has always been to me the final frontier, but incredibly expensive, and therefore we can't match America, so we become very reliant on them. If now everything's moving to be smaller, if it's smaller, it's easier to get into orbit. There's more cost-effective ways of getting stuff into orbit now.
Yeah.
We may not be suddenly being the forefront of rushing to Mars, but I do think in terms of national capability, it's quite inspiring seeing the sorts of things that our space industry can do. And this was attracting people, Americans, Swedes, all sorts, into their team. And it was clearly just inspiring a whole generation of people to try and
Yeah.
tackle what looks like an impossible project.
And I think the right language is a democratization of space. I mean, what that means is commercial enterprises have military use. So it's not just a military problem here, and it's not just a military solution. There are commercial solutions. I mean, Starlink's proved that in spades in Ukraine. So yeah, really important part of the future, and we in the UK could be well placed to do more, and we probably do need to do a lot more.
The other one I just wanted to quickly touch on is at the point of recording this, we got news that a Merlin Mark IV tragically crashed at 3:45 this morning down in the West Country. We understand that all three crew members perished. I'm always fascinated when these stories happen because there are a lot of people suddenly hit the news and media suddenly with conjecture about what happened. And the story is always seems to be about the wreckage. You and I have both been through a lot of accidents, lost a lot of colleagues over the years. There's a really important human dimension to these accidents, isn't there?
Yeah, and condolences obviously to all the friends, family, and loved ones of those that are lost. I mean that helicopter can carry a lot more people, so thank goodness it wasn't full. But yeah, you obviously have to respect what's happened, and obviously respect the families. So yeah, conjecture's never helpful. I mean, there are times sometimes, and I've even done it myself, where actually scotching rumours means you sometimes do need to declare more information than perhaps you'd want to. And I think the MOD's policy of say nothing until the inquiry is complete is so hard to hold on to these days, because that could be months. You'll always find someone who'll comment on it, even if it's unofficial. So it is really difficult. My big takeaway is, while we've been waiting for the dip to be released, we've got lots of bad news, bad press about how defence is weak, doesn't have the right capabilities, is underfunded, blah, 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 blah. And we've got, at the same time, we've got the government and defence saying they're on a war footing. I mean, we could argue quite what that means. But I think the important takeaway from this is those men and women, that was 4 something in the morning. That's an exercise area. That's people training to fight in case there's a war tomorrow. Yes, it's a training accident, but that is our armed forces practicing things that, for all they know, they could be doing tomorrow for real. So it's worth people realizing this isn't just another helicopter accident. This is an incident where our men and women put their lives on the line, even when they're in peacetime. Very sad, but as you say, you and I've seen that before.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, on the headline, as you say, when we've lost people, it's not about the aircraft, it's about the people. It's not just the families. They've lost husbands, fathers, sons, daughters. That has a profound implication, not only for them, but the rest of the team. There's also all the squadron colleagues, because it's very tight, that whole community. I think, you have to look also at the search and rescue folks. I mean, that is no fun. Huge credit to the people who do that. And I also know that, there is an incredibly professional team that looks at the whole circumstances, make sure that they look into every aspect of it, not because they're trying to blame somebody, but because they're trying to learn from it. Is there anything that happened here that we can avoid this ever happening again? But for me, I think, to your point, we tend to forget that, in peacetime and in the commercial civilian flying world, there's a set of rules, and basically everybody's trying to stay right in the middle of the safety sphere. If you're flying an airline, you don't want to go anywhere close to being to the edge of the. Whereas most military, we operate very close to the edge, because, when the war happens, you can't say, oh, the weather isn't very good, or I'm a bit tired, or the visibility isn't very good. You have to find ways of doing it. And my understanding is this is the Commando Helicopter Force, 3:45 in the morning, very early in the morning. It's not great weather at the moment. And they would have been honing their skills, doing an amazing job, preparing for the worst, preparing to stand on that wall, deter our nation's enemies. And that is happening 24/7, 365 days a year across our military machine. And tragically, every now and again, it goes wrong. And luckily, there is an incredible system that looks at this whole, look at the airframe, looks at any potential, is there something wrong with the helicopter? Could that have caused that? Is it human factors? Was it the weather? They will get into all of that. They will analyze all of the data. That takes a lot of time, but my goodness, you need to do that to make sure all the lessons are plucked from that. Will that stop our brave men and women for still training hard, preparing for war? No, they can't, because we never know where that's going to lead us. You and I were veterans of a Cold War when we were never sure when the balloon would go up, and we had to be ready for it. I think, so for me, it's undying admiration for the team that do this. A tragic accident, my sympathies go out, and all of our sympathies go out to the families and everybody. But my goodness, it is just an example of the professionalism and the courage of all of our men and women serving their nation, and just a reminder of the ultimate price that can get paid.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it is, thank goodness, a relatively rare occurrence these days. And that's because we have learned lessons from those past incidents, accidents, and we have learned how to not take unnecessary risks. But yeah, as you say, we are sometimes flying a lot closer to the edge of that envelope than a normal run-of-the-mill operation would be, and that means your risk is increased. But if you don't train close to that edge, then you're not going to function in a war. You need to be able to cope with all of that brings. So yeah, it's sad, but unfortunately one of those factors in being in the military. So yeah, with all the bad press and everybody having a go at we're rubbish. There's some men and women out there doing incredible things every day, and we just need to remember that occasionally.
No, and that's I think my takeaway from it as well is that defence is getting a bit of a bashing at the moment, because it's not configured the way it needs to be for. But I think we need to be very careful to separate out the men and women who serve in our military, who I believe are doing an outstanding job in often very difficult circumstances, often spending a lot of time away because we are being stretched so far. It's just that they don't have enough. We haven't got it deep enough. We haven't got enough equipment. We haven't got, and therefore, what we have got is being pushed a lot harder. Thank goodness of the professionalism, but my goodness, let's be careful not to conflate criticism of our politicians for not actually configuring defence properly versus the outstanding job that our men and women do serving their country on a daily basis.
Yeah, and just linking back to the book and this podcast, I mean, you and I know this, but we know that those men and women can't really speak for themselves. They're not allowed to. They have to be very careful about what they say. They can't be political in any way. We can. There are things we can say to try and educate, to try and inform, to try and highlight where there are issues, and that's why. Quick plug. Get anybody to read this book. Your family, there it is. Your family, your friends. Just to start a conversation. What, blimey, what would that be like? Imagine if that happened. What would we do? Would we run to the hills, disappear to Bermuda? What is it that you would do? Would you go and get a uniform out the cupboard as a reservist and recognize that you've got something to do? Would you head back into the office and turn your commercial manufacturing business into something manufacturing drones? We need to start thinking about how we might do that, because the more ready we are to do it, the less likely we are to be seen as a soft touch. And at the moment, I think media isn't helping. We're probably seen as a bit of a soft touch. I think it's about time we hardened up a bit.
Great message.